All
And
right.
I think we have, I think everyone who is in the main room looks like they've been assigned or they're actually not in the session. So why don't we go ahead and get started?
Great. Sounds good. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm Paul Alexander. I'm a member of the Guidestone board and really pleased to be in the session with all of you and to introduce Patrick O'Neill as a farmer myself and a master gardener for CSU Extension. I think we, like all of you, recognize that healthy soil is really absolutely critical for the work we do and for the salvation of the planet. So to be in this conversation with Patrick, I think is just really exciting. A reminder to mute yourselves. Looks like everybody's done that, so that's great. And you can either type in your questions in the chat box, or I think we're small enough at the end, we can just open it up and Patrick will answer whatever questions you might have. So just a little bit about Patrick. He works with farmers and ranchers using a holistic approach to develop and sustain soil health. And I think that holistic approach is really great. He talks about everything from soil fertility and plant nutrition and microbial balances and grazing and pollinators and compost and irrigation. So he really has a good feel for what it takes to have healthy soil, and he's been based in San Luis Valley of Colorado since 2005, and he works to really help farmers and ranchers do the best cropping and livestock operations they have. So Patrick, it's all yours.
Are you guys able to see my screen? Should say static pile fungal rich vermicompost.
Yep.
Great.
Good to go.
All right. Well, thanks for having me today. As Paul said, I've been in this region for a while now, and I'm happy to be with you here today. The project I'm going to talk about is how it relates to soil health. It's a project of farmers and ranchers who banded together in order to figure out if they could make a type of compost that was very unique, or what looked like it would become very unique in its effect on the soil and on productivity and the thriftiness of systems. And who I partnered with to do this was Moscow Hooper Conservation District, which is a soil water conservation district on which I serve as a supervisor, which covers Alamosa County, and Ute Mountain Ranch, which is a commercial composting operation in our region. Soil Carbon Coalition, which is a national 501c3 that works with farmers and ranchers on how to understand what the function of their own soils are. My company, Soil Health Services, and 14 farmers and ranchers from our San Luis Valley and from the Uncompahgre Valley. We're on the western slope. Events. So we started off with the premise trying to answer the questions of, is it even possible? We had been challenged over many years to wonder, could we get really good quality composts available to us for use? Can we make them in big ways to have impact on our farms and ranches? And can we make it functional here? Some background. Over the years, we've been challenged severely by drought and water availability. In 2000, in the San Luis Valley, things were feeling pretty good. By 2005, we were in the grips of drought, and by 2015, we were having to ratchet back massively on many of our irrigated acres because we just didn't have enough water to go around to cover our high value crops. And so we had to begin rationing through this process. And as a result, our cost of production on any acre of land that we were utilizing increased greatly over time. And so we had to figure out how could we support the health of the soil while not breaking the bank. We looked to people like Dr. Elaine Ingham and Dr. David Johnson, each biologists of different sorts, soil microbiologist Dr. Elaine Ingham, and and soil molecular biologist, Dr. David Johnson. Both were pointing in the same direction. Dr. Elaine Ingham in the early 2000s was beating the drum loud about the importance of feeding the soil food web, and especially of recovering fungal diversity in our agricultural soils that tend to be very bacterial dominated. And Dr. David Johnson emphasized and reinforced this concept, and these are some of his slides on the far right, with this successional graph showing plant productivity or above ground biomass relative to how much fungal to bacterial biomass is in the soils that support those systems. And you can see the higher the productivity, typically the higher also is the fungal biomass in those soils. So from the period of about 2000 to 2015, we've been on the hunt for really good quality fungal composts to introduce into our mostly bacterial dominated disturbed soil systems. And we've been searching for what's felt like a needle in a haystack, really, and never happened upon in that 15-year span a good quality source of fungal rich compost to introduce into our systems to try to jumpstart them. In that same period, I did a lot of experimenting with compost teas and also with locally available composts that were typically made in windrow processes that are highly disturbed, typically highly bacterial. What we found was we had a high variety and an inconsistent response when we use these types of materials, even at high quantity in agricultural settings. So they provide some nutrients, but really the microbial component and how to influence the microbes in soils when using those materials became erratic or difficult to anticipate. In 2015, I got a chance to meet Dr. David Johnson and his wife Wei Chen Su, who had developed in New Mexico in Las Cruces a particular method of composting that seemed intriguing because it was developing a highly fungal material that was unique in that regard. It was also a no-turn type compost that was looked accessible to a farm scale. You could do it yourself, and they were providing freely the tips and tricks on how they got the high quality compost that they achieved. So they showed us how to do it, and some of the research that went into their work with that compost, looking at comparisons of what, when they used compost of different sorts, what kind of output resulted. These are graphs showing plant growth when grown in media. This is a greenhouse environment, so grown in media that had high fungal to bacterial as compared to had low fungal bacterial ratios in that media, based on the dosing of the static pile compost as compared to using standard type composts in other medias or things like Miracle-Gro or that sort of thing in media. And they saw that the productivity, which is the blue bars in above ground biomass or above pot biomass in this instance, was not well correlated to how much NPK or organic matter was in that media, but it was highly correlated to the fungal to bacterial ratios in those particular pots, in mixes in that media. And so that was reinforcing what Dr. Elaine Ingham some 20 years ago had said, what we need to be driving towards in our agricultural systems as well. Looking at how much material they were using of this particular static pile vermicompost that Dr. David Johnson and his wife had developed the process to make. It was just a smattering, really. They were putting on 400 pounds of finished compost material per acre equivalent in some of their early studies, which is like pixie dust amounts compared to the many tons that many other vegetable farmers, for instance, would be looking at applying in order to see some margin of return. They trialed it on cotton, on chili production, chili peppers, on forage crops, and saw notable increases in their productivity with a one-time application to the ground of this 400 pounds of material per acre. And over time, so this is over multiple years, have reported that their soils are becoming healthier and healthier. The amount of carbon accreting in these soils is increasing, and they're not supplementing additional inputs, which these were all things that were intriguing to us and saying, well, if it could happen somewhere else, maybe we could try to make it happen at home. And so that's what we did. Our farmer group of 14 put money in a pot to entice a commercial contractor who makes compost as a living to take on this method and adapt it to a commercial scale, or what would be hopefully a commercial scale, and so that farms that are of commercial scale as well could access the material. And what he developed was this static pile process that developed into a nutrient rich, but more importantly, a fungal rich vermicompost that appears to be pretty good quality from all the things that we can have learned about it. Again, what we were hoping to achieve, that we never had before, we did achieve. We've had a high fungal to bacterial ratio. On the screen, you see a 1.98 to 1. Commonly, our soils in the arid West would be 0.25 to 0.8 to 1, perhaps, which would be dominated by bacteria, and that's why those ratios would be below 1. So this would be a material that's notably higher in fungi than bacteria that we would be introducing into those soils in order to kickstart them and try to push them in the direction that they could become more productive and thrifty. So we began with field trialing in the San Luis Valley and in the Uncompahgre Valley, taking a bulk application and just mirroring what David Johnson had done in his initial plot studies and field trials in Las Cruces, and seeing if we take 400 pounds of this material that we produced locally and put it into fields, what could we tell? The cost of that to those farmers at that time was $180 per acre. And then we tracked through our conservation districts and efforts at gaining some funding for lab fees and sampling. We tracked through time starting last year what was the impact on the crops, comparing large areas treated versus large areas not, side by side, the same crop at the same time. And what we saw was documented in this particular platform that the farmers have access to, and that there's a public viewable portion of this platform as well, so that others who are interested in the project can track it over time. You can see on this map the locations, the geographic distribution of where these different applications happened that were paired, treated versus not treated, so that we can keep tabs on them. And these are on commercial farms and ranches. This is the people who we were working with. Farming and ranching is what they do day in and day out, and that's their primary means of subsistence or of making a living. We had acres treated that were ranged from 15 acres treated paired up with 15 acres not on the same field, all the way up to 60 acres treated for 60 acres not. And they were pairwise comparisons, so that we could tell based on yield, based on other quality parameters, was there some notable differences happening where we had to compost as compared to where we didn't. And some of the highlights from this are shown on this table. The increases, what we saw stand out where we applied the compost, and some of the things that we thought were definite benefits. I'm gonna pause here and open it up to questions, because I'm sure there may be a few questions from this audience. So feel free. I haven't been looking at the chat. I don't know if there are people writing in, but if the moderator can call on people or let me know if there are people chatting in.
Yeah, Patrick, so I don't see any in the chat right now, but I would say that folks feel free to just unmute yourselves and ask any questions.
Yeah, great.
And don't be afraid, like all questions are good questions. It's a lot of
Yeah,
information.
and I can scroll back, or if you, and it's a lot to try to understand, well, why is this different than anything else if you haven't seen or been exposed to this idea of a static pile vermicompost before. So feel free to ask any questions about that. Dr. David Johnson has been incredibly generous by posting much of his research and his how-to videos on YouTube. So if there's questions regarding that, I'm happy to field them about what he has described previously and I've understood, or about what we took on locally.
Patrick, I have a question. Are you going to cover just briefly what goes into the static pile? And when you say static pile, that means that you're not turning it at all?
Yeah, so the standard composting process that most commercially available composts will endure involves taking carbon-rich materials and nitrogen-rich materials, mixing them up, and either introducing some set of microbes to those, or using just the ones that are flying around in the ambient environment, or that come in already attached to the starting materials, putting them in a wet environment, usually in a windrow, so a long heap that a tractor with a turner can be driven over the top of, and then that's turned time and again and again. It could be turned 20 times in the span of a few weeks in order to distribute oxygen through that pile and to vent the pile, because all those microbes that are in that mix create a huge amount of heat, and that's part of what is a process that allows human pathogens to be killed off in a compost pile. But it's also because of the turning and because of the constant disturbance, it's also what prevents fungal development from occurring very well, or to much extent. And so it becomes a very bacterial rich media because of all the constant disturbance. So a static pile process inherently is one where you're not actively turning that material. And I'll go back to some slides that show this. So this is a picture in your screen that's what would look like an actively turned compost windrow. So the heaps here would have a big rotor and a drum with teeth on it that would go through that pile and tear it up and cause it to invert time and again through the span of multiple weeks. And that would be the digestion process that would be occurring, would involve partly that, to distribute oxygen to maintain that drive, those bacterial booms. The process that is the static pile compost process that Dr. David Johnson and Wei-Chin Su developed is inherently a no-turn process. So to get around the need to introduce oxygen constantly, they made passive aeration channels with those PVC pipes you see inside that cage, which is the cage and the pipes are separated by a mesh, effectively a mesh bag. Think of it like a shade cloth material that sits atop the pallet. So the intent is to have oxygen availability to all these digesting microbes so that you don't need to turn them. And because it's a high moisture environment that you're not turning, there's opportunity for fungi to develop in that system. After the heating process, because these two go through a definite spike in temperature after you mix all the carbon-rich materials and the nitrogen-rich materials together initially. After that heating process, once you get into a more cool phase of the compost, then that's when composting worms like California red wigglers are introduced into the process to make it into a material that is distinct from what you would find outside of a vermicompost. So those are some distinctions. And again, you're not turning this, the air vents that are created by those pipes are eventually well, that they are the breathing tubes. Effectively, those pipes get pulled out. They just are forms really for the pile to settle around, and then the tubes remain, or sorry, the chimneys remain for air to be introduced throughout that pile passively. So hopefully, if there's other questions about the static component, feel free to ask them. I can go into as much detail as you like.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now, Patrick.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
hi, this is Lainey. I'm here.
Yep.
I had a quick question. I started typing stuff, but it might be here. I'm thinking this could be really cool for our community gardens, and as a small scale and just using garden waste. What are your thoughts about that on a small scale? And we are also up at 10,000 feet. So I'm thinking this is only more feasible in the summertime where our night temperatures average around 40s, in the 40s outside. So I'm curious of like what size do you think needs to work to make sure that the worms are warm enough in the pile? Just curious. Thanks.
yeah, so one of the big challenges that we had to overcome or figure out if we could overcome was how to keep it from becoming an ice cube in the wintertime. So this is not a fast composting process. The windrow type composting can be a fast process because you can digest a lot of material quickly with the turning. However, the static pile process is inherently a slow process. It takes a year or more in order to make this type of compost to the quality that we want to achieve. For a community garden type project, I think this is an excellent opportunity. I will caution that if you're using materials that could harbor human pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella or fecal coliforms, those are materials that you will need to have some sort of a heat treatment prior to using that material, or prior to, as a first step of your composting process, really. So the heat treat can be affected by forced air. You can get an air pump, and there's lots of things online that you can check out about how do you do a pre-digestion of your compost in order to assure that human pathogens have been heat treated out. But once you have that forced air heat treatment of things like manures or even if they're food wastes that have been that you need to treat before you put them in a compost pile of any sort, you can do that. Put them in a static pile process. The way that we approached it, anticipating that we were going to have intense cold in the wintertime and it's a high moisture environment, we needed to find shelter for this process for our worms and for the rest of the microbes to be able to continue to do their thing throughout the winter. And so we chose to put the whole process under a hoop house. And that's where the composting happens, is under a hoop house for us. And so if you have a greenhouse space or a hoop house space that you can carve out a corner of for making such compost, that would be ideal, so that it doesn't freeze solid in the wintertime. If it freezes, then all of the process stops. And if you have to wait for it to thaw out again, and then so you're waiting and waiting and waiting, the freezing, if it freezes solid, you'll lose the worms that you've introduced. They won't survive that. And so those are definite considerations to anticipate if you're going to take this approach.
So
Patrick,
Patrick,
did you have a
just,
question about frequency of watering? Since you mentioned it has to be wet, can you kind of expand about how to do that?
This is a definite wet process compared to many other compost types. You're looking to achieve 70% moisture. So if you picked up this mixed material the day you're making it, because that's another thing. it's not a layer cake kind of a process where you can just add to the top, add to the top, add to the top. It's not like a worm bin where you're just throwing food wastes on the top and that, using it that way, because we want this to be a material that is not harboring pathogens, potential human pathogens. We're making it all at once so that we can affect that heat treatment step and get that done well, and then move on to the more interesting parts of making compost. And we're supplying all of the foods that the worms will need at the get-go. We're not top feeding later on in the process of this year. But to the moisture, yes, we're definitely supplementing moisture on a daily or every other day or every third day basis, depending upon how quickly the pile's drying out. The day that you make this, it'll feel like a wet material. You'll be able to barely squeeze a drop of moisture out. We're shooting for about 70% moisture content of this pile. And so it's considerably wetter than other finished composts. It also means that when you're done with the compost process, you have a very wet material too. And that leads into considerations about how do you apply it and how do you get it out to your field, or what's the best utility. But yes, definitely setting up for top watering and making sure that you're not leaving it to dry out is a critical consideration.
And how about temperatures in the hoop house? That was another question. It talked about the highest temp, but is there kind of a high low as far as managing the temperature in the hoop house?
Yeah, so the hoop house that we used for this project did not have a heating system. So it was just whatever heat we could accumulate in the pile itself, and that would be the thermal battery through the winter and through the night. So we weren't heating. There were times when the top inch or two of the pile would get ice crystals in it, but because they were deep piles, the vast majority of all the microbial life and the worms were not affected by those intense cold temperatures. The pile itself, once in a while, would get down to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, deeper in the pile, but most of the time it was running 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. On the top end, the shade cloth structure that you saw with David Johnson and Wei Chin Su, the picture of with the pipe sticking out of it, that structure where they were making it was in the desert in Las Cruces. So very high daytime temperatures, ambient daytime temperatures. They use shade cloth in order to reduce the evaporative losses from the edges and from the top of that pile. In our hoop house environment, with the doors closed, we could easily get well over 100 degrees in that environment, so 120 degrees. Because of the great buffer capacity of all that moist material, we weren't getting extreme high temperatures in the material after the intentional initial heating phase. We were running 80, 90 degrees somewhere in there during the summer times in the pile itself, which is great because that's where most of the microbial activity wants to be, is somewhere between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's where we'll get the most cycling of nutrients and cycling of materials.
Great. And then we had a question about, that's really interesting, about the one fairy dusting. Was that enough to kickstart the biodynamic process in the fields? That's really all you needed, was to get that process going?
Yeah, so hopefully time will tell, because where we're at in our process, we made the initial compost and then applied it with almost all the applications being done spring of 2020. So we have just one field season and one crop season to track and to say what the immediate impact was in making use of this compost. We do have funding from some of the grant sources and government entities that have taken interest in this project and this process, in order to track over time if that one-time initial application will be enough to sustain some some beneficial impact on the soil, or if it will become necessary to make frequent pre-plant applications, or now an offshoot of this is to take that material and use it as a compost extract. So a water infusion of this material into water, taking that water and using it for transplant drenches, or using it for an in-furrow application, or through drip system, in order to nurse along those plants as they begin. Is that a good use for this type of product in order to jumpstart a system? Those are all things that we're evaluating, and time will tell.
Great. I think that's all the questions at the moment. Go ahead.
I have a question. When you say water infusion, is that different than compost tea, or what do you mean by that?
Sure. So compost tea and compost extract are two terms that are similar in some ways, but very different in others. So a compost tea is an idea where you're taking a relatively large volume of water and a relatively small volume of compost, and with a mesh bag, and typically some sort of an apparatus to make the water turn. Commonly that's air. You're forcing air into the water so that it bubbles, and with that bubbling action, you're introducing oxygen and also agitation, so that more of whatever is stuck on that compost can be dropped into the water. You're also taking some sort of a food substrate that can cause a quick growth of microbial life in that tank in the presence of oxygen. You're introducing things like sugars or kelp or humic acids, other potential food substrates for selected or for very specific or what will become very specific segments of the compost microbiome, and you're increasing those with those particular food substrates. The diversity of the microbes in your compost are likely immensely greater than what will be woken up by your food sources. And so you, with a compost tea, given food sources and given time, in order to increase whatever's in that tank and the relative proportion of the things that wake up with that food source, you tend to get something that is much less diverse than what you began with. And those fractions that woke up with the food sources that you gave them are then what you'd be hoping will do some work for you when you introduce that liquid into your field environment, whatever way you're going to get it out. So that fed compost tea, that's an idea that takes multiple hours or even days to make or quote unquote brew. Take a different approach, taking this unique compost material and similar apparatus, could look like the same tank, or it could be the exact same tank, but what you're doing is you're intentionally not feeding it. You're not introducing those things that are going to cause quick bacterial booms or quick booms of something that will selectively feed on whatever you're introducing. However, you are infusing in that water all of those exudates, all of the things that have made the microclimate, those chemical exudates, the enzymes, the vitamins, the plant growth stimulants, all of those things are getting infused into the water with a really quick spin, effectively, or agitation. The microbes themselves, the resting phases that aren't firmly attached to the compost material, can float into that water, can go into that water and suspend into it. The microbes themselves, the fungal hyphae, may not break off of the compost because that's what their home is, that's what they're living in. And so that segment may retain with the compost. However, the what's gone into this water infusion, this extract, has a large enough signal typically that you can take that if the compost quality is high, and in our instance, the vermicompost component and the fungal component, those impart to that water a very unique signature, that when you take that water that's infused with that compost into the field early season, you can see a dramatic difference in plant growth. There's some critical features of that. When you get it into the soil and you get it out of the sunlight and you get it out of a range where it can desiccate quickly. So it's got to associate with plant roots. So compost tea and compost extract. Compost tea, you're trying to selectively boom some sort of a subset of protozoa, bacteria, fungi that can do some work for you when you introduce them. In the instance of compost extract, what you're really trying to do is stimulate your native biology to do the work for you, to support your plants as best they can. So it's a different concept. And with a compost extractor, you're not intentionally forcing particular segments of that biology with selective food sources.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And Patrick, just as a heads up, we got about 10 minutes left. So if there's
Okay.
anything else you want to make sure you can get in. Great questions.
Yeah, if there's more questions, I'm happy to talk through them. The rest of what I have on slides are just breakdowns of these different, they're effectively graphics of the same table that you see before you, and a credits sheet of who helped us along the way. So I'm happy to put that up last if there's more questions.
And one, just to, as you go forward, is there a way to keep in touch with, what you're learning and all that?
Yeah, there is. So that this app, soilhealth.app, or this webpage, I guess, soilhealth.app is the location that you'd go to check on these community-based projects. And the intent of this platform, the soilhealth.app, which Soil Carbon Coalition developed for this purpose, was so that farmers groups and ranchers groups could better communicate one with another. They wouldn't necessarily need to wait for a specialist like me to interpret for them, did something work, did something not work. They could have a more directed forum to talk one with another about what's working, what is not working, and share data and share experiences on a kind of a smaller community platform. And that some segment of that could be outward facing, not just inward facing, so that other interested parties who are keen to support or cheerlead for such efforts could do so and could view in an anonymous way what's going on out in the world of regenerative agriculture. So you can check this app. You'll find our San Luis Valley project there. You can also check the Moscow Hooper Conservation District website, which I think there's a link to here. And that's what this link is here. You can copy down that link and stay tuned that way. You can email our conservation district from time to time to find out more information. The material itself, the compost, the commercial composter liked the experience and the farmers generally like the experience. So he upscaled again what he was doing and has made that like material available to farmers and ranchers to purchase. And so that's something that if you don't have your own compost material and you want to source it and jumpstart your own process, that's available too. And the conservation district can facilitate finding that material and sourcing it. Yeah, I guess that's how you can stay tuned. Who it is that we've worked with in order to pull this off. We've had lots of dialogue and lots and lots of dialogue with Dr. David Johnson and Wei-Chin Su over the past 6 years about could we make this work and is it possible, is it feasible, and gone back and forth with them about project ideas on particular ways of going about it. And we're very grateful to them for their time. But beyond that, some of the funding that made this possible came directly from the farmers themselves. So they put, on average, was about $5,000 per participant who put money in a pot in order to get this project started. And with that initial fund, we got the first compost pile begun, and all that material that was originally spoken for went onto their fields for that first year in last spring or before. Beyond that, the No Regrets Fund, the Calhoun Christiana Fund, Colorado State Conservation Board, Soil Carbon Coalition, our own Muskoka Conservation District, Soil Health Services, my company, Records Johnson Family Foundation, and the New Belgium Foundation all contributed funds towards these efforts to understand, can we make this work for our own environment, and could we have bigger impact than what we've seen before with other compost inputs and other efforts to get farmers talking and ranchers talking one with another.
Patrick, I have a question too. You had mentioned that, if the pile freezes, the process stops, but it sounded like maybe like not all hope was lost at that point, that it can restart back up. It just prolongs the whole process. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's two things. This process is inherently a vermicompost process. So it is by design and by necessity something that you got to care for the worms in. And the success of this process and the success of people who have used materials that are vermicomposts, they're quick to attribute the component of the worms, what they do for that material. So it's not just a high fungal compost, it is a high fungal vermicompost. When you freeze the pile, you eliminate the vermicompost component. Some cocoons may be there, but mostly it's the living wiggling worm that's going to give you the work, or to do the work that gives you the benefit. So when you take a frozen pile and try to thaw it, it's selection pressure that you're using. What can survive freezing? So in a really wet environment. So again, freezing in a dry environment is a different thing than freezing in a wet environment. You're freezing in a really wet environment, so you're selecting for that subset of microbes that can survive that. And that's probably an unusual environment for a lot of our agricultural soils, is to be frozen wet and really, really wet. So to say when you wake up your pile after having been frozen, you're going to get a high quality material, maybe you will, but the quality really is the component of what does it do for your soil. And if you're introducing this into soil that is in a particular state where it could really use that vermicompost component to support plant growth, and you froze that out, then you're probably you're not helping yourself out as much. I think that's most of what I wanted to go over with you. Thank you for having me in.
And thank you, Patrick. This has really been super helpful. Look forward to hearing more what happens and seeing if we can duplicate some of that around here. That's really great.
Very good.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick. Thanks for giving us your time. And I did put the links in the chat. And we will try, when we send out the recording of this, we can try to send those links again. But they will be on the slides that Patrick shared, so you can pull them off of there as well.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Patrick. Take
Thanks.
care.
Bye.
Thank you.
And so for everyone who's staying as part of the AgriSummit for the
Thank you.
keynote, you can leave the room and go back into the main session. Okay.